You read something brilliant. You understand it completely. But the moment you try to explain it in your own words, it falls apart. That's not a failure. That's actually where real learning happens.
And if you want to master paraphrasing, summarizing, and wrapping up ideas clearly, subscribe to English That Works podcast. We show you how native speakers actually do this.
So stick around. This changes everything.
I'm Claire, by the way.
David here. Let's dive in.
So what's the difference between just repeating something and actually paraphrasing it?
Paraphrasing isn't just using different words. It's understanding something so deeply that you can explain it in completely fresh language. Most learners just swap words, but that's not paraphrasing. That's word replacement.
So you have to actually understand the core meaning first?
Exactly. If you understand it, paraphrasing becomes natural. But if you're just shuffling synonyms, people can tell immediately. The meaning either comes through clearly or it doesn't.
That's why paraphrasing is such a good test of comprehension.
The best way to paraphrase is to read something, close the book, and explain it to someone like they're a friend. Not formal, not trying to sound smart, just honest explanation of what it meant.
So it's about clarity over sounding academic?
Completely. People paraphrase by breaking complex ideas into simpler parts. The government implemented new policies becomes they made changes to how things work. Same meaning, totally different level of complexity.
And that actually makes it easier to understand?
Paraphrasing matters in conversations, in writing, in every context. Someone says something confusing, you paraphrase it back to make sure you understood. That's powerful.
So it's a communication tool, not just a writing exercise?
Right. In meetings, people constantly paraphrase to confirm understanding. So what you're saying is, that's paraphrasing. It prevents misunderstandings.
And it shows you're actually listening.
The biggest mistake is staying too close to the original wording. You change one or two words, but keep the same structure. That's not paraphrasing. That's plagiarism with different vocabulary.
So you need to change both the words and the structure.
Yes. If you read "the company increased revenue by implementing new strategies," a real paraphrase would be, "By trying different approaches, the company earned more money." Different structure, different vocabulary, same core idea.
That takes more thinking than just swapping synonyms.
In real conversations, paraphrasing is about checking understanding. Someone tells you something complicated and you say, "If I'm hearing you right, you mean..." That's paraphrasing, and it's incredibly valuable.
Because it prevents miscommunication?
Exactly. People appreciate when you paraphrase because it shows you're trying to understand them, not just waiting for your turn to talk.
That's a communication skill, not a language skill.
Now, summarizing is different. You're not paraphrasing one idea. You're pulling the main points from something longer, an article, a conversation, a video, and presenting them in brief form.
So summarizing is about condensing, not just restating.
Right. An article might be 2,000 words. A summary is 200. You're keeping the essential ideas and dropping the examples, details, and extra information.
But you still need to be accurate?
The best way to summarize is to identify the main point first, then the key supporting ideas. Forget about interesting details. Focus on what someone needs to understand to get the core message.
So you're being selective about what matters.
Exactly. An article about economic policy might mention 3 countries' examples, but the core idea is certain policies help economies grow. You keep that. You might drop the country examples.
That's harder than just copying parts of the original.
Summaries need structure. You open with the main idea. This article argues that. Then you add the key supporting points. First, second, third. Then you close with why it matters.
So there's a basic format?
Not a strict formula, but a pattern. Opening statement of the main point, then the supporting ideas in logical order, then the significance. That structure makes summaries clear.
And people know what to expect?
But summarizing isn't just for written work. In conversations, people summarize all the time. Someone tells you a long story, and you say, "So basically, you need a new job." That's summarizing in real time.
And that's useful because
Because it shows you understood the point, and it moves the conversation forward. Instead of repeating everything they said, you capture the essence and respond to that.
That's actually powerful communication.
Now, conclusions. This is where people often struggle. They summarize what they said, then just stop. But a real conclusion does something more. It connects the ideas to the bigger picture.
So it's not just in summary, here's what I said.
Exactly. A conclusion restates the main point, shows why it matters, and often points to what comes next. It ties the whole thing together and gives meaning to everything you discussed.
That's very different from just restating.
Conclusions take different forms depending on context. In academic writing, you might conclude with, "This research suggests that." In speeches, you might conclude with a call to action. In conversations, you might conclude by agreeing on next steps.
So the conclusion serves a different purpose in different contexts?
Right. The structure might be the same, but what you're concluding changes. A news article concludes differently than a research paper or a presentation.
But they all wrap things up?
Most conclusions start with restating your main idea, but in new language. Not word for word. You've shown what you meant throughout the piece. The conclusion reminds people of the core point.
So even in the conclusion, you're paraphrasing?
Kind of. You're reminding them what the main point was, but with the perspective of everything you've discussed. You're showing how all the pieces connect.
That makes the message stick.
A strong conclusion always answers, why does this matter? If you've discussed climate policy, your conclusion doesn't just restate the policy. It explains why understanding this policy is important for the reader or listener.
So you're connecting the topic to real-world impact.
Exactly. A conclusion that says, climate policy affects everyone because our choices today determine the world we live in, is stronger than just restating facts about climate policy.
That gives people a reason to care.
The strongest conclusions often expand the scope slightly. You've discussed one thing, but you end by connecting it to something bigger. This shows us how individual choices affect global systems. Or, this pattern appears in many fields, not just this one.
So you're opening doors, not closing them?
Right. You're not wrapping everything up neatly. You're showing how this idea extends beyond what you've directly discussed.
That's more interesting than just, and that's all, folks.
An academic conclusion emphasizes what the research proves. A journalistic conclusion might emphasize what remains to be seen. A speech conclusion might call people to action. But they all do the same basic work. They wrap up and point forward.
So the structure is similar, but the content changes?
Right. The pattern is restate the main point, explain why it matters, and show what comes next or what this means. But how you do each step varies by context.
That's actually really useful to know.
Weak conclusions repeat. In conclusion, I've talked about A, B, and C. Thank you. That's not a conclusion. That's just stopping. A real conclusion integrates and expands.
So you're not just listing everything again?
No. You're showing how everything connects. You're answering the question, so what? That's what separates weak conclusions from strong ones.
The so what question is powerful.
The best conclusions often leave the reader or listener with something to think about. Maybe a question, maybe a vision, maybe a challenge. Not just, this is what I said, but this is what it means.
So they're memorable, not forgettable?
Exactly. People forget the details, but they remember the feeling a conclusion gave them. They remember thinking, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way.
That's the difference between a conclusion and a conclusion that matters.
All three of these skills work together. Paraphrasing teaches you to understand deeply. Summarizing teaches you to identify what matters. Conclusions teach you to show why it all matters and what comes next.
So they're not separate skills. They're connected.
Right. When you paraphrase, you prove you understand. When you summarize, you prove what you understand. When you conclude, you prove why understanding matters.
So mastering all three makes you a much clearer communicator.
To practice paraphrasing, read something and explain it without looking. To practice summarizing, take an article and reduce it to 3 sentences. To practice conclusions, end by asking, why does this matter? What comes next?
So there are specific exercises for each?
Yes, and the more you practice, the more natural they become. Soon you're paraphrasing, summarizing, and concluding without thinking about it.
Like any skill, repetition builds fluency.
Native speakers paraphrase constantly. So, you're saying, in conversations. They summarize in emails. Just to recap. And they conclude in every speech, presentation, and email. These aren't fancy writing techniques. They're how people actually communicate.
So, learning these skills makes you sound more native?
Absolutely, because these patterns show up everywhere in authentic English. In podcasts, videos, conversations, business meetings.
So paying attention to how native speakers do this is valuable.
Advanced paraphrasing isn't just changing words, it's changing perspective. The policy failed could be paraphrased as, the intended outcomes didn't materialize, or people didn't adopt the changes as hoped. Different angles on the same basic truth.
So you're showing different ways to understand the same thing?
Right, and that helps people understand more deeply. When you hear the same idea from multiple angles, it solidifies.
That's why good teachers rephrase things constantly.
When topics get complex, summarizing becomes even more important. Scientific papers, policy documents, long reports, they all need distillation. Your job is to find the signal in the noise.
So in a 60-page report, what's the 5-sentence version?
Exactly. What would someone who didn't read it need to know? That's your summary. Everything else is detail.
That actually requires understanding the material really well.
The most powerful conclusions don't just wrap up, they open doors. This shows us that X is possible. What if we applied it to Y? Or we've discussed the problem. Here's where the solution might lie.
So, they're actually the beginning of something new?
Right. A conclusion in a speech might lead to a call to action. A conclusion in an article might lead to more research. A conclusion in a conversation might lead to a decision.
So the conclusion isn't the end, it's the launch.
Master paraphrasing and you understand things deeply. Master summarizing and you communicate efficiently. Master conclusions and you make your ideas stick. Together, they make you a clear, powerful communicator.
So these 3 skills actually multiply each other's power?
Absolutely. You need all 3. Paraphrasing without summary is wordy. Summary without conclusion is incomplete. But all 3 together, that's fluent communication.
That's a powerful framework.
If this helped you understand how to paraphrase, summarize, and conclude more effectively, subscribe to English That Works podcast.
We break down communication skills that make you sound more fluent and more confident. Every episode, one skill that actually matters.